Hello, fellow marketers. I'm Brian Bowie, and welcome to another episode of Directive R&D. Today in the lab, I'm joined by a special guest, our VP of Client Strategy, Jesse Seilhan. Jesse, welcome to the show.
Hey, happy to be here, man. You've had some illustrious guests. I'm glad to get some space in the lab.
Of course. I'm surprised we haven't had you on earlier. Where's your green?
I know. I'm sorry, man. St. Patrick's Day, or I got some white for the lab coat, but that's about all I'm doing for matching you today. I'm sorry.
All good. Well, super excited to talk to you today about a common SEO topic that's debatable. It's subfolders versus subdomains. So hot topic, but very important when choosing where to place your content on your website. We prepared a little bit of a short deck today, so I'm going to share my screen and we're going to go through it. See my screen all right?
Yep.
All right.
And I
cool.
recognize those guys on the front there.
Wow. Who's that with no glasses or no? Who's that? Wow. Back of your head. So what's a subfolder and what's a subdomain? If you can kind of break it down for people who aren't familiar.
Yeah, to put it blankly, I mean, if you take your website and whether you put something in front of the website name or after the website name, so let's say you're Nike and you want to have a shoes page, creating nike.com/shoes, that's a subfolder. And if you did shoes.nike.com, that's a subdomain. I'm sure you've run across them already with all the different sites you go to for your bank or your billing, other stuff. You're going to see these two structures kind of out there in the web.
Makes sense. And it's a common thing you see with blogs, right? Either blog.domain.com or domain.com/blog. Is that right?
That's probably like the most heavily contested battleground for this specific type of battle that you see waging across all digital marketers. That one for sure is probably the biggest one we see.
Got it. Cool. So probably everyone's wondering which one do you choose? We're going to jump straight into some different scenarios, for both proponents, but we want to kind of walk through what we've tested with our own clients to shift from one to the next. So what are we looking at here?
So this is a client that we did the transition from the subdomain to the subfolder structure. And pardon that little sharp fall off the cliff at the end there, but that's just kind of the way analytics does when you don't have a full week's worth of data. It looks like your site blew up. But really what we saw was growth. We did see that moving that content from the subdomain to the subfolder was an improvement. And the reason for that is and this is kind of the general difference between subdomains and subfolders, is that when you build a subfolder, and you can think about this, Brian, you've built our blog, the pages on our blog, you go into WordPress and you click, new page, and it adds that little subfolder or that piece next to subfolder. It carries everything about the website with it, right? The nav, the footer, the structure, the architecture, all that stuff kind of gets carried. It's kind of built into the DNA. And if you've done a good job building your domain, all your internal linking, your hierarchy, your click depth, if all that stuff is good, then you're kind of just adding another kind of log onto the fire. You're going to keep burning brighter. You're going to keep burning hotter. Whereas subdomains, they don't have to be, but they tend to be kind of treated like a side project a little bit. Sometimes they have a different nav and a different footer. So they kind of lose that link. So when we moved all this content from this kind of orphaned, island area onto the main site, suddenly all these connections were allowed to happen. All this internal linking made more sense. All this click depth from one page to the other all worked really naturally, and it kind of lifted the entire site together. So that's in this particular case why we saw growth for this client.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's not just this case, right? We've seen it multiple times. It's one of the lowest hanging fruit a lot of times with clients that have all their content on a subdomain. Something we definitely recommend testing. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think that's an important point too, because it should be treated a bit like a test. And like most tests, you have to be careful with, what you're testing and what your parameters are. And what I mean by that is a lot of times the transition from subdomain to subfolder is successful, not just because you made that move, but because you optimized the content along the way. Like, for example, if we were going to move over content, for a client right now, sure, we would map out, here's the subdomain URL and here's what the subfolder URL is. But let's take the time now to update the meta titles. Let's take the time to get the internal linking better. Let's fix some other common SEO issues, because when you get that new site live and that new domain live, that new URL live for, let's say it's a blog, you kind of get one shot to make that first impression to Google when they index that page. And you want them to index it the best way possible. Like you want it to be the best first impression where everything is just lined up. Because if you just copy and paste the content over, then they're just going to say, yeah, same old content. I don't know. Maybe it's as good as it was before. Who cares?
Yeah.
And you have no idea when they're going to come back and index it again. Right. So that's part of the part that makes this debate so tough is that very rarely is it just a straight copy and paste from subdomain to subfolder. We are at least usually making some improvements along the way to make it really kind of this best of both worlds type of thing when it's finally live in its subfolder.
That makes a lot of sense. So moving on to another scenario, and this is looking at different KPIs and a different metric around domain authority. What are we looking at here when, what are we looking at here?
Yeah, so let's start with domain authority, right? So this is a proprietary score from a company called Moz. If you're in digital marketing, you probably heard about them. And they're one of the big proponents of subfolders. They wrote a blog many moons ago about this debate. Just as a happenstance, when I started doing SEO 6 years ago, people were having this debate. There was a piece written by Ahrefs that we're going to link to from a week ago where we're still having this debate.
Wow.
But in this case, this is using their tool, their metric called domain authority, which really kind of identifies the strength of a domain based on a lot of factors. Primarily backlinks is a big one of them. And that's a case too, where you can imagine where once you move all this content over, suddenly the backlinking kind of farm or network or spider web has more pages to reach into. And there's more opportunity internally to kind of link correct. I think it's one of the problems with subdomains is that when people build that separate site, they don't think about how their main site and their subdomain talk to each other. They just think that this subdomain is its own thing. My regular domain is its own thing. And I'm not going to really, cross the lines there. And that's where, now neither site is really doing too well. And then we step in and say, well, what if we optimize the content and put it on the main domain? Then we can kind of lift the main domain alongside of it. So that's what we're seeing here is once we move that content over, it really rose high. We rose past our competition for the domain authority score, and we're doing pretty well with that.
That's crazy. And knowing it, domain authority and seeing a score around 68, it's pretty hard to move up in a lot of cases being that high already. And then just making that shift, jumping 4 points, that's very significant, would you say?
It was, yeah. And with Moz, they've made a lot of changes to this metric, particularly over the years. But one thing that has stayed constant is that it is difficult to make jumps in this one. It gets harder and harder the higher your score is. So this was an impressive jump just, very quickly after making that change.
For sure. So this is the opposite side. So what are we seeing here?
So yeah, we had a client who wanted to switch to a subdomain, and again, that's okay. It's all about how you do it and if you do it right. And in this case, maybe not done so well. And I think this kind of speaks to why subdomains get created in the first place. I would say the most common reasons come from a developer angle, not a marketing angle. Right? You may have an in-house marketing team or in-house developer team or developer agency who is really pushing for a subdomain. And it could be because that's where they're comfortable. They think it's the easiest to maintain, easiest to update, and they may be absolutely right. The problem is that if marketing doesn't have a voice in that conversation, we can have situations like this where all the hard work, all the page views you've been building suddenly get cut in half in just a single month's time once you make that shift, right? Yeah. Sometimes it's the technology you onboard. HubSpot, as much as we love working with HubSpot and some things, if that's also kind of how you build your website, by default, your blog has to live on a subdomain. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just something to think about as you're kind of building your site, which platform to choose, which CRM to choose. You got to think about all this stuff before you kind of just, you want to aim first before you shoot, right? And that's how people get in trouble sometimes with subdomains.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So if you're just a new viewer, you're probably thinking, wow, these guys really recommend moving from a subdomain to a subfolder, or even just avoiding a subdomain altogether. But next slide, here's a case that we've seen where a subdomain can potentially work. And in this scenario, we're looking at resources.workable.com. Check them out. You can kind of see that they have, almost $2 million in traffic cost on a subdomain hosting all of this content. So Can you tell me a little bit about why this works, how it could work for Workable? Do you think they would even benefit from moving this content to their main domain? What are you thinking here?
Yeah, so this is the perfect example of why subdomains can and should work, which is if you go to this website, if you go to resources.workable.com, it is an entirely different thing than workable.com. And what I mean by that is workable.com, like most sites, are built to sell you something or to, be a part of a program or something. There's some sort of action they want you to take, right?
Mhm.
Whereas their resources subdomain is really for their clients, their existing customers. So they want their customers to still find their content. They want it to be searchable, to rank really high, but they don't necessarily want them to be hit with sales, jargon, and vice versa. They don't want, potential new clients to be hit with resource materials and, FAQs and things like that, right? So they split their website, a main domain and a subdomain, and all of their most important bottom of funnel keywords that marketing cares about, well, those are still targeted right on the main domain, and they're going to drive the traffic they want there. But all of their, it's not even a funnel, it's kind of past the funnel, like, more client focused, like support focused keywords, like a lot of their branded terms or their product terms, FAQs, support, manual, driver, all those kind of things. That's all going to be, the focus of the subdomain. And actually, when you go there, their nav is completely different. It doesn't represent, the same nav on their main site, but they were smart with their footer, and they still have interchangeable kind of links between the two. So it does feel cohesive. So a subdomain really works. And again, it comes down to what content you're talking about here. We had one client who, they were a very kind of, let's say, stuffy industry. They were established, and their blog, their messaging was very stuffy. It was very corporate, and they wanted to create a voice. They wanted to have fun with some of their content, which is awesome. We love hearing that when we work with people, but they didn't feel like their main blog was really the place for that content. So they created a subdomain that had a different look and feel, different color scheme, different voice in the content. And again, because we understood what the point of the content was, we were totally okay with them building a subdomain because it was going to rank for different keywords, have a different voice, be a different thing. Okay. But if you're building a subdomain that is essentially saying the same stuff your main domain is, there's really no reason not to put it on the main domain. But Workable did a great job here understanding the difference in audiences, difference in content, and splitting out their domains.
That makes a lot of sense. So say, I know we talked a lot about migrations, and that's a common tactic we use to boost things when we can benefit from the main domain.
Yep.
Say if you're just starting out and you have a fresh site and you're figuring out whether you want it on a subdomain or a subfolder. And I know you mentioned figuring out your voice and who you're serving that content to and why. In that scenario, when you're starting from scratch, does it really matter which one you use? If you have very little domain authority and you're trying to figure out the best place for your content, or would you lean more on the side of a subfolder?
Yeah, if I was just starting out today, I would subfolder everything. And the reason is, basically when you build a subdomain, it's kind of like building a new website. So you would almost be building two websites from scratch at the same time, right? Like my main product page or my main corporate page, and then kind of the subdomain, whatever that content was. So when you're just starting out, you need all of the love and attention and backlink and ranking you can get on your main domain. And Workable has been around longer than 2015, right? So you could tell they made a conscious effort some years back to say, okay, we need to split it, but they didn't launch their entire product with this split, right? They waited until it made sense from their perspective, from an SEO perspective, a customer perspective, to make this move. So no, when you're starting off, don't dilute, Google's attention to your site and to your brand. Don't dilute backlink opportunities. Don't dilute the conversation. Keep everything focused on your main domain. And then if and when it makes sense, then you can think about how you can split it if need be.
Love that. Very cool. All right. So wanted to bring up, we're not the only ones. There's a lot of, you mentioned this old blog from Moz. I think we linked it here with that common debate. And then the Ahrefs one that's just updated like last week. I believe most of these say the same thing, but if you have any questions around the resources, there's a lot out there. If you want to check it out, just look up subdomains versus subfolders, and you'll find similar resources. From our examples here, we again are proponents of the subfolder in most cases. I'm gonna hop out really quick, and we're gonna just chat. Well, Jesse, that was super informative. And, you know, I think I answered most of the questions hopefully people would have. Anything else you would add around subfolders versus subdomains?
No, I think the main takeaway for me is before you even get to the part of trying to pick one or the other, you got to figure out what the content is. What's the point of the
Right.
content? Who's going to read it? What the purpose is there? That should actually help you kind of make your decision for you, frankly. But if you're starting with the architecture, then you're probably not thinking client first, customer first, you know, persona first. You might be thinking more engineering first, developer first, you know, that kind of first. And the more we think about our clients first, tend to be the better experience we create for them and for ourselves as well.
That makes sense. And I know this is going to be kind of a loaded question and lengthy question, but it might be good for another video. Are there any quick tips? We don't have to go into the details. If you're trying to make the migration from a subdomain to a subfolder. So like if there are some things, well, of course you should probably look it up online if you're doing it yourself, but are there some things people should really focus in on when making the switch?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, you need to build your 301 or redirection roadmap. That's probably the most critical piece. So what we're doing, right, is we're taking a bunch of URLs, individual URLs on the subdomain, and we're telling Google that, hey, we're moving it over here. And doing that is a lot like moving in real life, where you kind of tell the post office, like, I'm going from, you know, 12 A Street to 15 B Street. And they're like, okay, we got you. And they're going to send you your mail, but you're probably not going to get all of your mail. And so, so what happens with the 301 roadmap is basically what that lets Google understand is from day one, send all of the traffic over here. Like, don't even mess around. Don't even wait for it later. If you miss any of those URLs and it takes a while from Google to catch up on them, then it's going to be a problem.
Got it. Yep, that makes sense. I think we could, I would definitely recommend looking more information up if you're making the move. Potentially reach out to a consultant to make sure you're doing it properly, because it could be a big effort moving a ton of content from one place to another and making sure you want to do it right. So, well, Jesse, it was awesome to have you in the lab. Got to have you back again.
That was great.
If anyone has any questions, feel free to make a comment in this post. Otherwise, we'll see you next time in the lab. Thank you so much.
Bye, guys.